There's a lot of people that have heard of MK Ultra. It's become real popular. It's mentioned in the media all the time. It was featured in Stranger Things. And like they know about it, but they don't really know that much about it. They might have heard that there was some mind control aspects of it, and then there's a lot of people that haven't heard of it at all. And so then when they do hear about it, it just kind of sounds crazy and they think of it as a conspiracy theory. Well, MK Ultra was real, and essentially it was a secret CIA operation conducted throughout the 1950s and 60s that sought to identify procedures and techniques to alter human behavior. But that's putting it nicely. It was really an attempt to figure out how to manipulate people, extract information, and literally control people's minds. Yes, like create a Manchurian candidate. And it's really hard to know or understand the totality of the program because in 1973, the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, ordered the destruction of the records related to the project. However, not all of the evidence was erased, and what little the investigations have revealed is awful. For example, at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, patients were rewarded with heroin to take large amounts of LSD for long periods of time, while being observed and isolated and sleep deprived. Now, similar experiments were also conducted on prisoners in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, including one well known criminal, Whitey Bulger. He was portrayed by Johnny Depp in the movie Black Mass. And they were also experimented on there. But this doesn't even scratch the surface of how extensive or how horrible MK Ultra was. And this video isn't an attempt to do a full history on the program. But I wanted to talk about one specific doctor that I was unfamiliar with until I read Stephen Kinzer's book, Poisoner in Chief. And that doctor is Dr. Ewen Cameron. Ewen Cameron was a psychiatrist of the mad scientist variety, but this didn't prevent him from becoming the president of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations, and later he would become the head of the World Psychiatric Association, and that was after his involvement with MK Ultra. So how does one become an ideal candidate to conduct mind control experiments for the CIA? Well, what initially piqued the interest of the CIA was the work of Dr. James Hebb, who was performing experiments at McGill University in Montreal and were funded by the Canadian military. Hebb's experiments sought to test the effects of radical isolation upon intellectual function. During those experiments, student volunteers were blindfolded, fitted with earplugs, and had their hands and feet bound into foam rubber mitts. The subjects were then sealed into a small soundproof chamber and observed. In only a matter of hours, they became confused, disoriented, and after several days, most subjects completely broke down. Now, Hebb's work was appealing, but when the CIA discovered that he had a colleague that was pushing his experiments further in a more coercive direction, they knew they had found a more promising candidate. And this colleague was Dr. Ewen Cameron. Cameron's papers described his work as an attempt to do what he called repatterning and believed he could create new brain pathways by which he could reshape patients' minds. He described experiments where he would place patients in a clinical coma using hypnosis and drugs, including LSD, then enclose the patient in a small cell and subject the patients to endless repetition of simple recorded phrases. Now, most of Cameron's patients didn't suffer from crippling mental disorders, but from relatively minor ailments like anxiety, family struggles, or postpartum depression. Cameron would begin his experiments or treatments with extreme sensory deprivation. The patients would be given drugs that put them into a semi-comatose state for periods ranging from 10 days to 3 months. This would create, as Cameron described, not only a loss of space-time image, but a loss of all feeling. In more advanced forms, the patient may be unable to walk without support, to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence. So basically, he would turn these patients into people that could completely not take care of themselves at all, and they would lose the ability to control their bladder and their bowels. Then, in order to remove the unwanted thoughts from the patient's head, Cameron would use a technique that he called psychic driving, during which he would administer electroconvulsive shocks using charges that were 30 to 40 times stronger than what other psychiatrists were using at the time. After days of this treatment, the patient would be moved to a solitary ward where he or she would be fed LSD and given only minimal amounts of food, water, and oxygen. The patients would then wear helmets that were equipped with headphones into which repetitive messages or phrases were played hundreds of thousands of times. That's hundreds of thousands of times, just over and over again, being drilled into their head. Kind of like our modern day propaganda that you see in mainstream media. Cameron's papers and lab reports stated that he had succeeded in destroying minds, but had not found ways to replace them with new ones. So basically, he figured out how to wipe the hard drive, but couldn't figure out how to install the new program. One of the reports noted that I found troubling was regarding a young female patient. Cameron noted, almost proudly, that, I quote, "The shock treatment turned the then 19-year-old honors student into a woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed from a bottle, and urinated on the floor." Now, can you imagine being that young woman's parents? You're a father and your 19-year-old daughter, an honor student, she's having some issues with depression or anxiety, which is very common, and you take her to a doctor to get her help, only to find out later that you've handed her over to some kind of deranged, mad scientist, some sort of evil genius blinded by medical hubris, and he's so narcissistic that he operates with a complete reckless disregard for potential complications. He just sees himself as being ahead of his time and too brilliant for the average person to understand. And it's examples like this as to why it's good to maintain a healthy amount of skepticism of everyone, especially figures of authority. People have a tendency to defer to authority, especially when it comes to medical issues and doctors, because doctors, they've gone to school, they're very educated, and most people don't know a whole lot about their health. And, it's not always a bad thing to, consult with a doctor. But remember, doctors and other medical professionals are people just like you and me, and sometimes they don't know what's best. And sometimes they're complete lunatics. And it was this type of character and research that made Sidney Gottlieb say, now this is a promising candidate. Now, who is Sidney Gottlieb? Well, he was the head of the MK Ultra project and other questionable operations within the CIA. The nature of Cameron's experiments, coupled with the fact that he worked outside of the United States, made him an ideal candidate for an MK Ultra contractor. Now, in order to conceal the fact that this was part of a CIA operation, Gottlieb reached out to Maitland Baldwin, a neurosurgeon and research scientist at the National Institute of Mental Health, in order to recruit Cameron. Now, Baldwin was able to reach out to Cameron and suggested that he apply to the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology to receive funds to carry out more intense experiments. Cameron applied and was quickly approved for the funding under what was called Subproject 68. Now, this is how many MK Ultra collaborators were financed and controlled without any knowledge that they were working for the CIA. They would set up bogus foundations and front groups to fund the research of hospitals, universities, clinics, prisons, and other institutions that were unknowingly contributing to a secret CIA operation. And it's not just with MK Ultra. Many times when the CIA is doing things like this, they finance the projects through, front groups, and a lot of people don't even realize that they're working for the CIA. Now, Cameron, at least initially, believed the money was coming from a legitimate foundation because Maitland Baldwin provided the credibility and sold Subproject 68 as civilian research. Now, the agreement for Subproject 68 consisted of 4 steps that they wanted performed. Stage 1 was the breaking down of ongoing patterns of the patient's behavior by means of particularly intensive electroshocks, the depatterning. Step 2 was the intensive repetition, which was to last 16 hours a day for 6 to 7 days of a prearranged verbal signal. Stage 3, during the period of intensive repetition, the patient was to be kept in partial sensory isolation. And the final step, stage 4, required the repression of the driving period to be carried out by putting the patient, after the conclusion of the period, into continuous sleep for 7 to 10 days. Now, over the course of several years, the CIA would provide Cameron with approximately $69,000 to carry out Subproject 68. And that's $69,000 in 1950s money. So it goes a lot further than it does today. But he also carried out other experiments aimed at wiping away a person's memory and implanting new thoughts into their brains. Now, the CIA and Sidney Gottlieb viewed Cameron's work as a potential revolutionary breakthrough in mind control and interrogation techniques. But a review conducted decades later would conclude that Cameron's techniques had no therapeutic validity whatsoever and were comparable to Nazi medical atrocities, which is an appropriate comparison when you understand that the MKUltra program was just an evolution of Project Bluebird that was conducted by the U.S. government with former Nazi scientists in post-World War II Germany at locations like Camp King and Villa Schuster. Ewen Cameron would die in 1967 before the public would recognize and understand the profound immorality that has now tainted his legacy. According to historian Alfred McCoy, during the period of Cameron's work for the CIA, approximately 100 patients admitted to the Allan Institute with moderate emotional problems became unwitting or unwilling subjects in an extreme form of behavioral experimentation. Years later, the Canadian government created an Allan Memorial Institute D-Pattern Persons Assistance Plan that ultimately provided 77 of Cameron's former patients with $100,000 payments. And as a result of several other lawsuits, including one in 1983 brought by the family of Velma Orlikow, just one of the many victims of MKUltra, the CIA paid the Orlikow's family and 8 others a total of $750,000 in compensation. Dr. Ewen Cameron's story is just one small part of MKUltra, but I thought it was a good one to cover because it's specific and easier to grasp for someone that might dismiss MKUltra as some kind of crazy conspiracy theory, because I think most people do. They hear people claiming the CIA was performing mind control experiments, and they dismiss it, and then they claim you've been watching too many movies. But MKUltra was absolutely real, and I believe that similar programs are still being carried out today, only at this point they're far more advanced. I think the revelations of MKUltra and other similar projects are a form of strategic transparency, designed to create the illusion that our institutions regulate and police themselves and actually have the best interest of American citizens. Just another way for the normies to dismiss it and say, oh, that happened a long time ago, and they wouldn't do that now. Yeah, like our government is clearly operating with a much better moral compass now. It also allows the government to control the narrative by directing public anger towards individuals, specific bad actors like Sidney Gottlieb and Ewen Cameron, rather than systemic issues and broader corruption within the government, because they want to deflect the attention and prevent any deeper and potentially more harmful investigations. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment.